His clothes were stained with blood, his house isolated on the edge of town. Children were warned not to look him in the eye. In the square, he was feared and hated, but paid by the city to kill in their name. Today, you will learn how executioners lived in medieval Europe, people who were paid to kill. You will also learn about their isolation, rituals, and the brutal reality hidden behind the blade. In a medieval town square, under the watchful eyes of hundreds, justice unfolded not in courtrooms but on platforms soaked in old blood. Public punishment was both performance and warning, a spectacle meant to terrify, humiliate, and ultimately reinforce order in a world teetering between divine law and human chaos. When a thief was dragged to the scaffold or a heretic to the flames, the crowd wasn't just watching justice, it was participating in it, feeding a collective hunger for vengeance and moral reassurance in a time when fear held civilization together. From the 12th century onward, as cities expanded and criminal codes multiplied, the need for specialists in punishment grew impossible to ignore. Lords and magistrates required someone precise enough to behead with a single stroke, strong enough to bind and flog without hesitation, and calm enough to burn flesh while ignoring the screams. The executioner emerged not as a monster, but as a tool of authority, trained to carry out pain efficiently, his hands steady even as the crowd wept or cheered. This was no work for amateurs. Too many strokes in a beheading, and the crowd might riot. Too much hesitation, and justice would seem weak. Executioners were often chosen not for their character, but for their availability. Sometimes, condemned men were offered freedom in exchange for picking up the axe. In other cases, butchers were recruited, already skilled in dismembering animals and hardened to blood. The job carried no glory, only necessity. Towns needed someone who could endure what others could not, but they made certain that person would never forget what he had become. Once chosen, the executioner was marked in ways that went far beyond his bloody profession. He was not simply avoided out of superstition or fear. He was deliberately excluded from nearly every aspect of communal life, as though proximity to death had rendered him spiritually diseased. In many places, executioners lived outside the town walls or near leper colonies, their homes isolated like outposts for the damned. Even in cities where they performed essential tasks, ranging from executions and torture to cleaning latrines or disposing of animal carcasses, they were unwelcome in taverns, markets, or public baths. Some were forbidden from touching food in open stalls, their shadow considered enough to contaminate goods. Others were required to announce their presence by ringing a bell or wearing distinctive clothing that made avoidance easier. A brush of the hand could be seen as polluting, and in extreme cases, any physical contact had to be cleansed through ritual or penance. The church, which oversaw the moral order of the age, often reinforced this exile. Although executioners served the secular law, their trade in blood made them unworthy of the sacraments. Priests denied them communion. Confessions were refused or postponed, and marriages within the faith were heavily restricted or annulled. Their children bore the same burden, unable to enter guilds, inherit property easily, or marry outside their caste of shame. In effect, a life spent enforcing justice became a sentence of slow, silent exile. That silent exile did not make the task any lighter. If anything, it forced the executioner to retreat deeper into the rhythm of his work, where precision mattered more than pity, and failure could cost far more than reputation. A man who botched an execution, who missed the first stroke or left a condemned body twitching too long, risked being stoned by the crowd or stripped of his post entirely. For all the disdain directed at him, the executioner was expected to act with the flawless efficiency of a craftsman, even as blood soaked his boots and screams echoed through the square. Every punishment demanded a specific technique, learned through grim repetition or instruction passed down in secret. A clean beheading, for instance, required an understanding of anatomy, the exact placement of the blade, the tension in the victim's neck, and the executioner's own breathing and posture. Hanging was no less technical. Done poorly, it meant slow strangulation instead of the swift snap of the spine. Breaking a body on the wheel, a punishment reserved for the most reviled, required a methodical destruction of limbs in a precise sequence to prolong suffering without immediate death. Some executioners treated their duties as ritual. Before an act of punishment, they might drink heavily, offer a muttered prayer, or prepare their tools with obsessive care, as if warding off failure through repetition. Others coped by turning cold, detaching entirely from the humanity of those who knelt before them. Either way, the work left its mark, not just in calloused hands and weary joints, but in the silence that followed each scream, a silence no applause could break, no payment could soften. In towns where justice was performance, the executioner remained the most invisible of actors, his face sometimes hooded, his name rarely spoken, but his work burned into memory long after the gallows were gone. Though his name was rarely spoken aloud, his services were nonetheless compensated, often in coin, but sometimes in forms more grim and symbolic. Executioners were paid per task, with rates varying based on the method and the social standing of the condemned. A noble's beheading could bring several times the amount earned for hanging a beggar, while torture sessions conducted in dungeons before trials might be commissioned for extra fees, especially when confessions were expected swiftly. But these payments came irregularly, and towns, ever reluctant to acknowledge their dependence on such men, often delayed compensation or withheld it entirely after public outcry. To balance this, executioners were commonly granted rights denied to others. They could claim the clothing, personal belongings, and even horses of those they executed, possessions often stripped from the condemned moments before death. Some were given state-owned property on the outskirts of town, and others received exemption from certain taxes or military service, as if the violence of their profession alone fulfilled their duty to the realm. Over time, these small privileges accumulated into a strange form of twisted prestige, one born not of honor, but of tolerated necessity. In rare cases, executioners used their legal authority to navigate danger. If attacked, they could appeal for protection under the same laws that empowered them to kill. And if accused of a crime, their profession often granted them leverage in negotiation, since few towns could afford to lose their only trained punisher. Yet this legal shelter was fragile, resting on the ever-shifting favor of magistrates and townsfolk, whose moral judgment could swing violently with each botched stroke or unpopular death. Thus, the executioner lived at a narrow crossroads, one foot in poverty, the other in privilege and with no stable ground between. That unstable footing did not end with a single man's death. For many, the role of executioner became a sentence not just for themselves, but for their children and grandchildren, passed down like a stain that could never be scrubbed away. In numerous cities across the Holy Roman Empire, France, and parts of Italy, executioners belonged to tightly bound families whose names were known yet never spoken, whose lineages were recorded not in honor, but in whispered warnings. A son born to the axe was rarely offered another path, as few would hire or even acknowledge the kin of a man who took lives for coin. Marriage prospects were bleak, often limited to the daughters of other executioners, bathhouse workers, or grave diggers, those who, too, stood on the edge of accepted society. These unions formed insular communities, passed from father to son, built not on pride, but necessity. Their homes stood at the town's fringes, their trades whispered about behind closed shutters, and their children taught early that no matter how clean their hands remained, the world would still see blood. Some families tried to escape. They fled to distant towns, changed their names, or attempted new trades. But the past had a way of catching up. A single mention in a legal register, a forgotten face recognized in a market, or the slip of a priest's tongue could unravel years of careful hiding. Even when anonymity was preserved, the internal weight of inherited shame lingered, an invisible chain binding each generation to the work of the last. That invisible chain rarely broke, even in death. For many executioners, the final act of life was marked not by release, but by a continuation of exclusion. Denied burial in consecrated ground, their bodies laid to rest beyond the churchyard wall or in unmarked plots near gallows and slaughterhouses. Death, which they had delivered to others so many times with practiced precision, arrived not as a great equalizer, but as yet another reminder of their separation from the rest of the world. The church, ever wary of their touch, treated the executioner's soul with suspicion. He had served justice, yes, but through violence, and that violence, repeated and institutionalized, was rarely seen as compatible with salvation. Some priests refused last rites, others performed them reluctantly, whispering prayers with averted eyes. In folk tradition, executioners often became cautionary figures, restless spirits who wandered crossroads, demons in human skin, or vengeful ghosts doomed to relive every stroke of the axe they once delivered. These stories did not emerge out of cruelty, but from the moral discomfort that surrounded their existence. A man both of the law and outside it, necessary but never clean. And yet, in some rare chronicles, there are traces of redemption. A few retired into monasteries, hoping to wash their hands in silence and prayer. Others, too old to lift the blade, passed their tools to sons with trembling hands and distant eyes. Townsfolk might whisper of one who spared a child, or delayed a death long enough for a pardon to arrive. But those stories often faded, overwhelmed by the weight of everything else. Long after the gallows rotted and the scaffold was dismantled, the memory of the executioner lingered, not as a man, but as a shadow cast by society's need for order. His hands were steady, his conscience buried, and his legacy carved not in stone, but in the silence that followed every death. If you enjoyed this story, trust me, the next ones will be even more powerful. You're about to hear things no one else is telling. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming. If this video moved you, leave a like and drop a comment. And most importantly, share it with someone you care about. See you in the next video.